So my name's Dan, and I'm looking at mediating core beliefs between self-reported childhood trauma and adult romantic relationships. So first question, how would you feel if somebody flopped these flaccid bananas in your fruit bowl? You'd be feeling a bit off about it, wouldn't you? But you might be feeling off about it for different reasons. One is you might be thinking that word flaccid is just awful. That's an awful word to describe those bananas, but they're a bit, well, it's an apt word to describe them, isn't it? But when I was looking at that gift, it actually reminded me of a situation that my aunt was talking to me about. She turned around and she was, a child in school, and she had this teacher with really dark sunglasses. And she was supposed to eat a sandwich. I think it was like a banana sandwich or something. And the glasses were so dark, I don't think her eyesight was very good, that she couldn't see that there were actually ants in the sandwich. And my aunt turned around and she said, well, there's ants in this banana sandwich, like I can't eat it. And the teacher said, no, I don't see any ants. Eyesight wasn't too good. Forced her to eat this banana sandwich with ants in it. Since then, she cannot eat or look at a banana or a sandwich that even resembles that in any way. I think that's a bit of an example of childhood trauma in a sense. But if you look at this, perhaps you might be influenced by it. That might be a situation, if that was something that came to your mind, it might remind you, oh, that was an awful situation when I was younger. Or maybe you might look at that, if somebody puts those bananas in your bowl, you might turn around, you might think something along the lines of, well, you know what, I'm going to throw those out because they look disgusting. But why might you think that? Well, you might be thinking, I need to put them in the bin because if somebody eats one of them or somebody grabs one, well, it might make somebody sick. There's a variety of reasons that you might react to certain things. And one aspect of it is, in the case of my aunt, well, you've got the childhood trauma there. You've got the situation where the childhood trauma is influencing the decision making. But another one might be perhaps the schemas that somebody have or the core beliefs that they have around certain things that may influence that relationship. So in that sense, you might look at something like that, and if you're looking at the health concerns, maybe you're thinking on the lines of vulnerability to harm. Maybe you're thinking something like this could potentially harm you. So here's another example. I Googled worst PowerPoint presentation, and this was the first result. I hope nobody has a slide like this. If anybody's slides resemble this at all,
it's busy.
Hey, that's stressful. That gives me a headache just looking at it. But maybe somebody looking at it might have a different reaction. Maybe somebody's more offended at this image than what another person is. Maybe somebody might have a core belief of, say, unrelenting standards. Maybe somebody is, I don't know, like somebody that's in an administrative position of a company, and this comes on and they think, oh, that reflects poorly on me. Whereas somebody else might think, oh, that reflects really poorly on them. That's a terrible thing to include in a PowerPoint presentation. Even ironically, I'm sad that I even had to do it. So if we look at both these situations, and I'm really glad that that works even in a thumbnail, because I think we all need to look at it for a bit longer. That's great. So here's an example, vulnerability to harm. Well, it says it's the exaggerated fear of imminent catastrophe that will strike at any time. So if you look at that, you can think, oh yeah, well that might be something that influences that. You might think somebody's going to get sick and die if they eat that. Or perhaps you might have unrelenting standards. When you're looking at this, the underlying belief that one must strive to meet very high internalized standards of behavior and performance, usually to avoid criticism. What's interesting about how these schemas work is that they form in early childhood and in adolescence predominantly. And the work of Dr. Jeffrey Young, and it's fairly recent in schema therapy, has found that there's a whole bunch of different early maladaptive schemas. And usually the earlier that somebody develops one of these, the more pronounced or prominent that it is. One great example of it is the schema of abandonment, where even as a baby in the first year of life, say there's a situation where mum and dad are in a car accident, and they're given to another relative or something like that, and they're looked after, they're fed, and all that sort of stuff, and they're certainly going to get through life. They're not going to, be malnourished or anything. But they don't really play with the child or interact with it, and mum and dad's gone, so the kid's distressed. Well, it only takes 2 weeks for a schema of abandonment to develop and actually have a stranglehold or an imprint on the amygdala section of the brain. And what's interesting about that is that's essentially there for life. I mean, there's different impacts and different kinds of mindfulness that you can use to influence that relationship later on. But that person is probably always going to have a predisposition to abandonment. The other aspect of it is that generally you might have heard the term amygdala hijack or something like that with regard to how these different schemas can influence decision making. It was put to me once that core beliefs, or these schemas that are embedded in this section of the brain, are almost like the cellophane or the Valencia filter from which we look at the different situations in life. So what my study is looking at is how the self-reported childhood trauma is mediated by these core beliefs and how that impacts on adult romantic relationships. Personally, I've had schema therapy myself, and it's an incredibly powerful tool. And one thing I've worked out is that from my own therapies and different things, that I have the abandonment schema, and it's incredible the knowledge that you have as to why it's just the way that you are in certain aspects of your life. You can feel the danger, or you can feel some kind of uncomfortableness with something that somebody else is perhaps really comfortable with, like public speaking, a great example. So how would childhood trauma, like perhaps eating a banana sandwich with ants in it, influence adult romantic relationships? Well, one is that you might not go out for a banana split on a cute date or something. That's one aspect that could. But what about with the core beliefs? So how does self-reported childhood trauma, how is that mediated by the core beliefs? Well, one that's very pronounced in women is the idea of self-sacrifice. So the belief essentially that other people's need, or the core belief that other people's needs are more important than their own. And you can see that childhood trauma mediated by such a thought like that other people's needs are more important than my own, could have a potentially huge impact on adult romantic relationships and putting others first, even to your own detriment. Or maybe eating the banana that isn't so ripe while the other person has the firm banana. That analogy is just, if anybody's eating a banana later, I'm very sorry. So what we did was in this study, we hypothesized two things. The first is that self-reported childhood trauma has an impact on adult romantic relationships, which I think is pretty well studied, and it's certainly what we came to the conclusion to in the literature review. And even in culture, I mean, there's so many stereotypes about that. The person with daddy or mummy issues and how that impacts the adult romantic relationship. But this specific mediator of core beliefs, while it has been used as a mediator in other studies, specifically this hasn't been researched that much. And one of the great things about it is if we have the overall questionnaire of the Young Schema Survey, which was posed by Dr. Jeffrey Young, that can be broken down into different domains. So you can look at, well, how does self-sacrifice or abandonment influence or mediate the relationship between self-reported childhood trauma and adult romantic relationships? In this study, that's the second hypothesis, is that the overall score is what essentially mediates that belief. And I think that depending on the results, the data and the way that the questionnaire is set out could potentially lead to people thinking, well, maybe there needs to be some more research on each domain or each schema or core belief more generally. So what we've done is, ethics was a little hard to get approved for this one. Firstly, because my opening line in the ethics submission was, "How do you feel when you see these flaccid bananas?" No, but but essentially they did say that childhood trauma, is something that's very intense to survey people about. So we've made special considerations with this. One was that we're only going to survey the USQ students because they have various different support mechanisms through the university. The second is that we're going to be providing lifeline numbers and that sort of stuff as well. We're going to be using the 3 scales here, an adapted version of the Childhood Traumatic Events Scale to measure childhood trauma, experience in close relationship and bias for adult romantic relationships, and the Young Schema Survey questionnaire in the short form. That's all done via the online platform, and it'll be really interesting to see the results when they finally